नमस्कार दोस्तों, मैं विपुल इनकम टैक्स लॉ अपडेट में आपका स्वागत करता हूं। सीबीडीटी ने आज 25 नवंबर 2021 को एक सर्कुलर नंबर 20 ऑफ 2021 निकाला, जिसमें उन्होंने सब सेक्शन 4 ऑफ सेक्शन 194 ओ एंड सब सेक्शन 3 ऑफ सेक्शन 194 क्यू एंड सब सेक्शन 1H ऑफ सेक्शन 206 सी ऑफ इनकम टैक्स एक्ट 1961 के पे गाइडलाइंस निकाला है। Finance Act 2020 inserted a new section 194O of the Income Tax Act, which mandate that with effect from first day of the October 2020, an e-commerce operator shall deduct income tax at the rate of 1% of the gross amount of the sale of goods or provision of services or both, facilitated through its digital electronic facility or platform. However, exemption from the said deduction has been provided in case of certain individual or HUF subject to fulfillment of a specified condition. This deduction is required to be made at the time of credit of the amount of such sale or service or both to the account of an e-commerce participant or at the time of payment thereof to such e-commerce participant, whichever is earlier. Para 2 says Finance Act 2020 also inserted subsection 1H in section 206C of the Act, which mandate that with effect from first day of the October 2020, a seller receiving an amount of consideration for sale of any goods of the value or aggregate of such value exceeding 50 lakh rupees in any previous year shall collect from the buyer a sum equal to 0.1% of sale consideration exceeding 50 lakh rupees as income tax. The collection is required to be made at the time of the receipt of the amount of sale consideration. Seller as is defined as the person whose total sales or gross receipt or turnover from the business carried on by him exceed 10 crore rupees during the financial year immediately preceding the financial year in which the sale of goods is carried out. Central government has been authorized to specify by notification in the official gazette the person who would not be considered as seller for the purpose of this section, subject to fulfillment of certain condition as specified therein. Para 3 says Finance Act 2021 inserted a new section 194Q of the Act which took effect from first day of the July 2021. It applies to any buyer who is responsible for paying any sum to any resident seller for the purchase of any goods of the value or aggregate of value exceeding 50 lakh rupees in any previous year. The buyer at the time of the credit of such sum to the account of seller or at the time of payment, whichever is earlier, is required to deduct an amount equal to 0.1% of such sum exceeding 50 lakh rupees as income tax. Buyer is defined to be person whose total sales or gross receipt or turnover from the business carried on by him exceed 10 crore rupees during the financial year immediately preceding the financial year in which the purchase of goods is carried out. Central government has been authorized to specify by the notification in the official gazette person who would not be considered as buyer for the purposes of this section, subject to fulfillment of the specified conditions. Subsection 4 of section 194O, subsection 3 of section 194Q and subsection 1H of section 206C of the Act empowers the board with the approval of the central government to issue guidelines for the purpose of removing difficulty. In this regard, Vice Circular number 17 of 2020 dated 29th September 2020 guidelines were issued by the board with the approval of the central government in relation to the provision of section 194O and section 206 1H of the Act in certain cases to remove difficulty and provide clarity for certain transactions. And 4.2 further White Circular number 13 of 2021 dated 30th June 2021 guidelines were issued by the board in relation to the provision of section 194Q of the Act through which the difficulty arising from the applicability of the provision of section 194Q in certain cases were removed. Furthermore, guidelines with respect to the cross application of the provision of section 194O, 194Q, 206C, 1H of the Act were also issued through the said circular. In continuation of the above, to further remove the difficulty, the board, with the approval of the central government, hereby issue the following guidelines under subsection 4 of section 194O, subsection 3 of section 194Q and subsection 1H of section 206 of the Act. यहाँ पर डिपार्टमेंट ने बताया कि ये डिफरेंट गाइडलाइंस कब कब इशू किए गए इस फॉर द रिमूवल ऑफ द डिफिकल्टी फॉर द इम्प्लीमेंटेशन ऑफ दिस सेक्शन. नाउ न्यू गाइडलाइंस issued for implementation of this section. Guidelines 5.1 e-auction services carried out through electronic portal. Representation have been received from various stakeholders involved in the business of the carrying out e-auction services through electronic portal owned, operated or maintained by them, herein referred e-auctioner. It has been stated that an e-auction, the auctioneer involved in conducting the e-auction through its portal is responsible only for the price discovery for the sale purchase of the goods or services, and result of auction report is submitted to the client. The client could be the buyer or seller. Participant in the auction are seller if the client is buyer, or buyer if the client is the seller. The transaction of the sale purchase is being carried out directly between the buyer and the seller, which are not done through the electronic portal of e-auctioner. Further, the price so discovered can be further negotiated between the parties without the knowledge of an e-auctioner. In such a scenario, it has been represented that provision of section 194O of the Act does not apply, as the transaction of sale purchase itself is not taking place through the electronic portal. Further, 5.1.2 from the representation made, the following facts have been noticed. The e-auctioner conduct e-auction services for his client in the electronic portal and is responsible for the price discovery only which is reported to the client. B. The price so discovered through e-auction process is not necessarily the price at which the transaction takes place, and it is up to the discretion of the client to accept the price or it directly negotiate with the counterparty. And C. The transaction of the purchase or sale takes place directly between the buyer and the seller party outside the electronic portal maintained by the e-auctioner, and price discovery only act as the starting point of the negotiation and conclusion of the purchase or sale. The e-auctioner is not responsible for facilitating the purchase of and sale of the goods for which e-auction was conducted on in its electronic portal, except to the extent of price discovery. And E. Payment for the transaction are carried out directly between the buyer and seller outside the electronic portal, and e-auctioner does not have any information about the quantum and the schedule of the payment, which is decided mutually by the client and its counterparty. And F. The payment made to an e-auctioner for the providing e-auction services, the client deduct tax under the relevant provision of the Act other than the section 194O of the Act. Further, 5.1.3, in order to remove difficulty, it is clarified that the provision of section 194O of the Act shall not apply in relation to e-auction activities carried out by e-auctioner if all the facts listed at A to F of the para 5.1.2 are satisfied. This clarification shall not apply if any of these facts are not satisfied. Further, it is clarified that the buyer and seller would still be liable to collect tax as per the provision of section 194Q and 206C 1H of the Act, as the case may be. Second, 5.2 adjustment of the various state levies and taxes other than GST. 5.2.1 in para 4.3.2 of the circular number 13 of 2021 dated 30th June 2021, it has been provided that in case the GST component has been indicated separately in the invoice and tax deducted at the time of the credit of the amount in the account of the seller, then the tax is to be deducted under section 194Q of the Act on the amount credited without including the GST. It has been further provided that in case the tax is deducted on payment basis as the payment is earlier than the credit, the tax will be deducted on the whole amount as it is not possible to identify that payment with the GST component of the amount to be invoiced in future. Further adjustment of the tax deducted in case of the purchase return has also been provided. And 5.2.2, it has been represented that in case of goods which are not within the purview of the GST, such as petroleum product, various levies like VAT, excise duty, sale tax, etc. charge, while the treatment of the GST components has been clarified in the circular number 13 of 2021. The same is the silent on the other non-GST levies which have been otherwise been subsumed and replaced by the GST. And further 5.2.3, in this regard, it is hereby clarified that in case of purchase of goods which are not covered within the purview of GST, when tax is deducted at the time of the credit of amount in the account of the seller and the terms of the agreement or contract between the buyer and the seller, the component of the VAT, sales tax, excise duty, CST, as the case may be, has been indicated separately in the invoice, then the tax is to be deducted under section 194Q of the Act on the amount credited without including such VAT or excise duty, sales tax or CST, as the case may be. However, if the tax is deducted on payment basis, if it is earlier than the credit, the tax is to be deducted on the whole amount, as it will not be possible to identify the payment with the VAT, excise duty, sales tax, CST component to be invoiced in the future. Furthermore, in the case of the purchase return, the clarification as provided in paragraph 4.3.3 of the circular number 13 of 2021 shall also apply to the purchase return relating to the non-GST product liable to VAT, excise duty, sales tax and CST. Next guideline, applicability of the section 194Q of the Act in case where exemption has been provided under section 206C 1A of the Act. Subsection 1A of section 206C of the Act provide that notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1 of the said section, no taxes to be collected in case of the buyer who is a resident in India, if such buyer furnishes to the person responsible for collecting tax a declaration to the effect that the goods as referred to in subsection 1 are to be utilized for the purpose of the manufacturing, processing or producing article or things or for the purpose of generation of the power and not for trading purpose. Further, as per section provision of subsection 1H of the section 206 of the Act is to be collected in respect of the sale of the goods other than the goods which has been covered under subsection 1 or subsection 1F of subsection 1H. It has been represented that in case of the goods which are covered under the provision of subsection 1F or subsection 1H G, it has been represented that in case of the goods which are covered under such the provision of subsection 1 of the said section but exempted under subsection 1A, tax will not be collectible under either subsection 1 or subsection 1H of section 206C as the provision of subsection 1H categorically exclude the goods which are covered under subsection 1 of section 206C. It has been requested to clarify if the provision of section 194Q of the Act will be applicable in such cases. The issue has been examined. It is seen that the provision of section 194Q of the Act does not apply in respect of those transactions where tax is collectible under section 206C except subsection 1H of thereof of the Act. Since by virtue of subsection 1A of section 206 of the Act, the tax is not required to be collected for the goods covered under subsection 1 of the said section, it is hereby clarified that in such cases the provision of section 194Q of the Act will apply and the buyer shall be liable to deduct tax under the said section if the conditions specified thereof are fulfilled. Next, applicability of the provision of section 194Q in case of department of government not being public sector undertaking or corporation. In this case, there has been representation from the Department of Government, both central government and the state government is to inquire if such department is required to deduct tax under the provision of section 194Q of the Act. 5.4.2 para clarify as per the provision of the section 194Q, tax to be deducted by a person being a buyer whose total sales, gross receipt or turnover from the business carried on by the person exceed 10 crore rupees during the financial year immediately preceding the financial year in which the goods are purchased by such person. Thus, for a person to be considered as a buyer for the purpose of section 194Q of the Act, following conditions are required to be fulfilled. A. Such person shall be carrying out a business or commercial activity. B. The total sales, gross receipt or turnover from such business or commercial activities shall be more than 10 crore during the financial year immediately preceding the financial year in which goods are being purchased by such person. In case of any department of the government which is not carrying out any business or commercial activity, the primary requirement of being considered as a buyer will not be fulfilled. Accordingly, such an organization will not be considered as buyer for the purpose of section 194Q of the Act and will not be liable to deduct tax on the goods so purchased by them. However, if the said department is carrying on the business or commercial activity, provision of section 194Q of the Act shall apply subject to the fulfillment of the other condition. Issue has been raised in case where any department of the government will be considered as the seller for the purpose of the deduction of tax under section 194Q of the Act. In this regard, it is hereby clarified that the purpose of section 194Q, central government or state government shall not be considered as seller and no tax is deducted by the buyer in case where any department of the central or state government are seller of the goods. In connection with the above, it is further clarified that any other person, such as public sector undertaking or corporation established under central or state act, or any other such body, authority, or entity shall be required to comply with the provision of section 194Q and tax shall be deducted accordingly. Thank you so much for watching this update. This is the only recent update. I am trying to cover explanation in the